Kordofan, Sudan, 1883. The sun beats down relentlessly as you lick your dry, cracked lips. The thorny bushes rip at your legs and shred what's left of your uniform. You're bone-tired. It's taking all your strength just to keep one foot moving in front of the other. Curse the British and the Khedive back in Cairo for sending you into this wasteland of drought and death. Shielding your eyes from the sun's glare, you see dark figures on the horizon, emerging from the tree line. Your blood runs cold. Tens of thousands of fanatical dervishes are preparing to attack. With a great cry, your fellow soldiers form 3 squares, then raise your rifles and fire round after round into the screaming horde. Many fall, but still they come, seemingly immune to fear. They slam into your ranks. A soldier next to you gurgles horribly as a spear pierces his throat. Terrified, you thrust your bayonet into a dervish who has murder in his eyes, but they just keep coming. With the square surrounded, they hack away at you with spears, swords, and knives. Panic is gripping the ranks. More and more soldiers try to flee the squares to safety. You see one run past without his gun, only to be dragged to the floor by a sea of dervishes who hack him apart. You are just wildly shooting now, not caring if you hit one of your own soldiers or the enemy, when a searing pain erupts in your shoulder. You've been shot. With your guard down, a dervish takes his chance and leaps on you. He raises his knife and yells out, "Allahu Akbar," as the last sounds you hear are screams and gunfire. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Da wird uns ausgebeten. Wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. Before 1881, if you told a British official that the empire was going to be dragged into multiple wars in the Sudan, they would have looked at you like you were crazy. It was a barren, arid place, seemingly of little value. Yet that's precisely what happened due to the epic failure that was the Hicks expedition. Hicks's army has been called one of the worst in history. Made up of Egyptians led by British and European officers, it was utterly destroyed by the forces of the mysterious Mahdi, a holy man claiming to be the promised saviour of legend. The consequences of this disaster are still felt right up until this day. That Britain would become involved in Sudan certainly wasn't obvious, even to an experienced observer, for most of the 19th century. Sudan had little natural resources, while its primary industry was selling enslaved Africans to the Ottoman Empire. All in all, it seemed a benighted place that London had little interest in. Yet 2 events would change that dramatically. The first was the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. The canal would rapidly become the main artery of the British Empire, the shortest route to India and the Far East. The second was a great crisis that engulfed Egypt in 1881. By the mid-19th century, Egypt seemed to be modernizing fast, maybe even becoming the Japan of Africa. Technically, it was still part of the Ottoman Empire, but in reality, it was practically independent by now. The Khedive of Egypt, Ismail Pasha, was an ambitious reformer who wanted to modernize his country. He rebuilt Cairo on the model of Paris, complete with an opera house. He built railways connecting all the country's major cities. He even acquired his own European-style colonial empire in sub-Saharan Africa, reaching as far south as modern-day Sudan, Uganda, and Eritrea. The Suez Canal had been started under his predecessor, but was completed during his reign, and it became symbolic of the new, modern Egypt that was, in Ismail's own words, quote, "not now a country of Africa, but a country of Europe," end quote. This expansion relied heavily on European technicians and administrators, mostly British or French, who were invited to Egypt by the government and paid handsome salaries. All this cost money, though, a hell of a lot of money. Ismail funded this first through cotton exports, suddenly booming thanks to the American Civil War, and especially by vast loans from the West. Money was pouring in, often loaned at lucrative interest rates. Just like a drunken sailor on shore leave, the Khedive spent this as soon as it landed in his treasury. What could possibly go wrong? As it turns out, plenty. The Civil War in the States ended, cotton prices crashed, and soon Ismail couldn't pay the interest on his loans. Like so many future leaders in the global south, the Khedive began flogging off state assets to pay his debts, including the Suez Canal to Britain. Yep, that's how he got hold of it. But even this wasn't enough. Egypt went bankrupt. The great powers of the 19th century could teach the mafia a thing or two about getting debtors to pay up what they owe. They seized control of Egypt's finances until its debts were paid. Soon, Egyptians had to suffer tax increases and austerity programs, while foreign officials dominated their government. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this didn't go down well. In 1881, Egypt exploded into revolt, and a military officer called Arabi seized power and overthrew the Khedive. In response, Britain invaded, defeated the rebels, and put the Khedive back on the throne. Technically, he still ruled Egypt. In reality, power was now in the hands of Her Britannic Majesty's agent in Cairo, Sir Edward Mallet. The Khedive couldn't visit the bathroom without his permission. With Britain now dominant in Egypt, for the first time Sudan began to register on its radar. Still under Egyptian rule, the vast country hovered on the edge of anarchy, and Cairo's control did not extend much beyond rifle range. Soon, grim tidings made their way down the Nile from its main city of Khartoum, ghastly tales of rebellion and massacre in the holy name of God, and a figure called the Mahdi. The rebellion was led by a Muslim holy man named Muhammad Ahmad, who claimed to be the Mahdi, or Guided One, the direct successor of the Prophet Muhammad. His followers were known as Darwish, after the Sudanese colloquial word for holy men, later anglicized as dervishes. He had made it his holy mission to expel the hated Egyptians from all of Sudan, and then to carry Islam across the earth, killing all who opposed him. It's not an exact comparison, but there are a lot of similarities between the Mahdiists of the 19th century and the Taliban of the 21st. His revolt had started small, and he only had a few hundred followers. It was the complete incompetence of the Egyptian army and officials that allowed his movement to rapidly expand. The governor of Sudan, an inept oaf named Rauf Pasha, first of all tried to buy him off with a meagre pension. The Mahdi replied with a one-line letter, quote, "He who does not believe in me will be purified by the sword." End quote. "Next, Rolf," said an officer and sometimes slaver named Abu Saud to Abba, an island in the White Nile, to capture the upstart Messiah. On August the 12th, 2 companies went ashore in the hot and humid night. A major mistake, for the darkness deprived them of their only real advantage, their firepower. What followed changed Sudanese history forever. You are shaken out of a deep sleep by your friend Ahmed. "Brother, wake up! The Egyptians are attacking! They have come for the Mahdi!" Now wide awake, you grab your palm knife and follow Ahmed into the bush. Others soon join you, most armed with sticks, stones and hoes. Only a few have spears or swords. But an army's strength is not just in its weapons. You are fighting a jihad against the foreigners who rule your land. Against the might of Allah, no army can resist. Up ahead, you can hear the Egyptians clunking around, their silhouettes visible in the light of a few lamps. Silently you wait for the order to strike as their leader barges his way into the Mahdi's hut. Gunshots ring out, and the Egyptian flunky emerges triumphant, yelling, "The Mahdi is dead!" You smile. Everyone knows the Mahdi had given his hut to a guest. He is safe in the bush. At a nod from Ahmed, you silently slide up behind a soldier. Grabbing his mouth, you slide your knife deep into his throat. Meanwhile, an old man crashes a heavy stone onto an Egyptian's head, and his skull splits with a loud crack. Another soldier guns down the old man, screaming, "It's an ambush!" But he is too late as you pour out of the bush and begin slaughtering the Egyptians. Overrun by a howling mob of the Mahdi's ragged followers, armed only with a motley collection of rocks, knives, spears and clubs, the Egyptians fled in panic, leaving 6 officers and 120 other ranks dead on the island. Word of the astonishing Egyptian defeat spread across the Sudan. New recruits for the Mahdi's cause appeared in their thousands, many of them experienced fighting men. In December, the revolt escalated when the Mahdi destroyed a 1,400-man Egyptian force near Fashoda, south of Khartoum on the White Nile. The Mahdi's forces swept into Darfur, west of the Great River, and captured Senna, more than 150 miles up the Blue Nile, towards Ethiopia. A year after the revolt began, 4,000 Egyptian troops were wiped out in desolate Kordofan, southwest of Khartoum, at the confluence of the White and Blue Niles. The lethal tide of fanaticism was creeping closer and closer to Cairo itself. The Mahdi now gained the support of powerful slave traders who the Egyptians had tried to repress. Indeed, the Mahdi could be very practical when he needed to be. Cunningly, he forbade the enslavement of all his followers, including non-Muslims, but allowed the enslavement of all free Muslims who refused to accept him. Effectively, he kept everyone happy, except those unfortunate enough to actually be enslaved. In September, the Mahdi led a huge army against El Obeid, the principal town of western Sudan. Having been initially repulsed with huge losses because of the garrison's Remington rifles, the Mahdi's people simply starved the town into submission. Hideous scenes of privation followed, with corpses strewn so thickly that carrion birds gorged themselves until they could not fly, and were in turn eaten by the besieged. At last, in January 1883, with every sort of animal eaten and children dying of starvation, the city surrendered. In the process, the Mahdi acquired some 6,000 Remington rifles and 5 excellent Krupp artillery pieces to add to the weapons he had looted from the other Egyptian garrisons. This was no longer a force armed with hoes, stones, and palm knives. He was now leading one of the most formidable armies in Africa. With the fall of El Obeid, Cairo finally began taking the revolt seriously. If Khartoum were to fall as well, then all of the Sudan would be lost. Suddenly, with no expense spared, the largest modern army so far ever dispatched into the interior of Sudan was assembled. 8,300 infantry, nearly 2,000 cavalry, an artillery battery of 16 Krupp mountain guns and Nordenfeldt machine guns, and a baggage train of 2,000 men, and some 6,000 camels, mules, and donkeys. It should have been a formidable force that could more than hold its own against the motley rabble the Mahdi could muster. Yet, there is a reason this army is regarded as one of the worst in history. Its soldiers were truly appalling. Many of the troops had actually been captured by the British fighting for the Egyptian nationalist leader Arabi the previous year. They were a motley, unwilling and wretched mob, most of who had to be marched to the Sudan in shackles just to make sure they actually arrived there at all. A British officer who had inspected them in Cairo before their departure had been shocked to discover that some had cut off their own trigger fingers just to avoid being re-enlisted. Others had even rubbed lime into their eyes to ruin their eyesight. Almost all had attained forged certificates claiming that they could not be called on for further service due to a variety of ailments. Even those men who might have fought well, in particular the black Sudanese troops, endured such humiliating conditions that their morale was at rock bottom before they even arrived in Sudan. Once they were in Sudan, they were poorly fed and soon racked by illnesses such as malaria, dysentery and typhus, which didn't improve their morale or their commitment to the Egyptian cause. All in all, you'd be hard-pressed to find another army in history that was so filled with troops who didn't want to be there in the slightest and had absolutely no commitment to the campaign. It was unpromising material to beat the Mahdi with. The Egyptian government needed a tough, experienced commander, someone who could turn this demoralized rabble into a proper fighting force. It needed William Hicks, who this ill-fated expedition would be named after. Tall, rugged and physically tough, Hicks was a retired honorary colonel of the Indian Army. He had survived more than 20 actions in India and Abyssinia, and had been mentioned in dispatches twice. After retiring, he entered the service of the Khedive in 1882 as a pasha, a title equivalent to general or governor of a region. 53 years old and married with 2 children, he had come to Egypt to make his fortune, as European officers were still very well paid. He was a brave and competent soldier, but he had 2 big weaknesses. Firstly, he had only reached the rank of colonel previously. He had no experience of actually leading a whole army as a commander. This difficult expedition against the Mahdi was his first experience of executive command. Whereas a more seasoned commander may have listened to his gut, Hicks would allow himself to be persuaded against his better judgment into making some truly awful decisions. Secondly, he was ambitious and wanted to replace the current Sirdar, or Commander-in-Chief of the Egyptian Army, Sir Evelyn Wood. Only a major success can make that happen. Again, this would lead him to making decisions that would doom both himself and his army. technically Hicks was actually Chief of Staff to Suleiman Niazi, the actual Commander-in-Chief of the expedition. But Suleiman was actually something of a figurehead. Really, he was there so the Mahdi could make political capital out of fighting Egyptian forces led by infidel Christians. In practice, Hicks was expected to train, run, and command the army himself. Suleiman was old, stupid, and lazy. In fact, his nickname was Suleiman the Fat. He certainly did not want to be fighting religious fanatics in the deserts of Sudan. But he was a proud man, and very jealous of Hicks. He would soon start trying to undermine his supposed subordinate. Hicks had 11 European officers to help him make some kind of a fighting force out of this army of the unwilling. It was a truly multinational collection. There was the giant Prussian Major Baron Gotz von Seckendorf, 2 Austrians, some Italians, a Greek chief surgeon, and 5 Brits. Hicks's Egyptian officers were less than promising, and few of them spoke English. Most were not only unreliable and terrified of the Sudan, but were indifferent to their leadership responsibilities. In a letter home, Hicks complained, quote, "I reduced a captain to the rank of lieutenant the other day, but it seems to have had no effect, for I caught him neglecting his duties the next day." End quote. Literally every day, Hicks struggled with endless inefficiency and lack of discipline. He lamented that, quote, "It is no good giving orders. It is no use trying to put things straight. They promise to do what you direct without the slightest intention of acting, and are utterly indifferent, and not in the least ashamed when you find them out." End quote. Really, Hicks shouldn't have been so surprised that this was the case. Even the officers had literally been marched to the Sudan in chains. They didn't want to be there in the slightest. Hicks began a rigorous training program and did his best to weld this unpromising mass of reluctant humanity into some kind of an army. The first results were not promising. Hicks noted, quote, "When the guns were attempted to be brought into action, dire confusion reigned. Men ran against each other. The ground was strewn with cartridges. No one appeared to have the slightest knowledge of how to feed, aim, or discharge the pieces." End quote. In addition to the general apathy and incompetence, Hicks was also plagued by endless disorder among his irregular cavalry, the Bashi Bazouks, mostly Turks, Albanians, and Shagir tribesmen from the northern Sudan. They were a vicious lot of thieves and killers in their best tribal tradition. On at least one occasion, a European officer had to draw his pistol to enforce his orders. There were also some curious Sudanese cavalry encased in chainmail, seemingly left over from the Crusades. No matter how hard Hicks' officers pushed the army, it remained, in the words of correspondent Frank Power of the London Times, quote, "a cowardly, beggarly mob." End quote. All in all, it was an army of untrained, unwitting, and unpaid soldiers who had much more in common with the enemy than their own officers. It was a recipe for disaster. Winston Churchill would later call it, quote, "perhaps the worst army that has ever marched to war." End quote. Yet at first, there seemed to be signs for optimism. In April, this army of the damned actually defeated a large force of the Mahdi's men. 5,000 dervishes, made up of both cavalry and infantry, had appeared before Hicks's army near Khartoum. As the Egyptians formed hollow squares, the Mahdiists charged forward with cries of Allahu Akbar. They were met by a wall of lead as the Egyptians fired volley after volley from their squares, while the rebel cavalry soon scattered as the shells began dropping among them and fled in great confusion. In less than 30 minutes, the whole rebel force was completely disorganized and in full flight. They left behind 600 dead on the battlefield, while the Egyptians lost only 2 killed and 5 wounded. Soon the dervishes withdrew back into Kordofan, and Khartoum was safe for now. Just to explain what a hollow square was, it's a defensive tactic where infantry formed a square with a hollow centre, facing outwards to protect against cavalry charges, by presenting bayonets and firing in all directions. In the empty core of the square, there were the commanders, flags, reserves, or wounded. It was a good tactic, used often in the Napoleonic Wars. Further good news soon arrived. There were rumours that the Mahdi's coalition was fraying at the edges. Apparently the guided one had been a naughty boy. He was quarrelling with the sheikhs of the Baggara tribes, an important part of his force, over the booty taken at El Obeid. When the city had fallen, the Mahdi was said to have taken more than £100,000 from the officials and notables, which he then kept to himself, distributing nothing among his followers. On account of this worldly performance, many began to waver in their belief in his sanctity. Things seemed to be going well, but Hicks couldn't hide a feeling of unease. First of all, he was battling intrigues from his nominal superior, Suleiman. Relations got so bad that by July Hicks threatened to resign, forcing the Khedive to fire Suleiman the Fat and make Hicks the formal commander-in-chief. Secondly, Hicks wasn't a stupid man. He had deep misgivings about his army. In a letter to his wife, he admitted, quote, "The Egyptian soldiers were much steadier than I expected, but I don't know that they will be so steady when we cross to the Cordovan side, where we shall meet many more rifles and guns." End quote. Fighting in sight of the Nile, with the support of armed steamers, was one thing. Marching out into the arid steppes of Kordofan was quite another. In the West, we tend to associate Arabs with the desert, assuming they would be masters of desert warfare. But this wasn't true for the Egyptian soldiers in this campaign. They were mostly from big cities in the fertile parts of the country that were watered by the Nile. Many of them actually feared the desert, especially when stuck in far-off Sudan. He advised Cairo that the army should stay in the Khartoum region, keeping the Mahdi at bay, while they, quote, "wait for Kordofan to settle itself," end quote. This probably would have been the wisest course of action. Virtually everyone was telling London and Cairo that this army shouldn't be sent into the wastes of Kordofan. The journalist Power sourly noted, quote, "Even the most sanguine look forward to this march with the greatest gloom. We have here 9,000 infantry that 50 good men could rout in 10 minutes, and 1,000 cavalry that have never learned to ride to beat the 69,000 men of the Mahdi. I pity Hicks. He is an able, good, and energetic man, but he has to do with wretched Egyptians who take pleasure in being incompetent, delaying, and lying." End quote. But if everyone thought this was going to be a disaster, why was it allowed to go ahead? Partly it was due to the hypocrisy of the British government. Prime Minister William Ewart Gladstone, a Liberal, was reluctant to get drawn into the affairs of the Sudan, but he still wanted the Mahdi crushed. To square this circle, he carried on the pretense that the Egyptian government was in fact completely independent, and it was nothing to do with Britain if Cairo wanted to send forces to put down the Mahdi. At the same time, the British government, shall we say, encouraged the Khedive to do just that. If, against all the odds, Hicks succeeded, London could bask in the glory. If he failed, Gladstone believed, quite wrongly, that they could wash their hands of the whole matter. The Khedive, on the other hand, wanted to show that he had at least some power left. Plus, Hicks's recent successes meant that he now underestimated the Mahdi. Surely, he must be on his last legs by now anyway. This all left poor Hicks in an awkward position. It was his first big command, and he wanted lucrative employment with the Khedive afterwards. If he refused to march to Kordofan, this could be in jeopardy. Against his better judgment, and at the cost of his life, Hicks allowed himself to be swayed, and he marched off into the wastes of Kordofan in September 1883. Coming along for the ride were correspondents Power, the drunken Edmund O'Donovan of the Daily News, artist Frank Viselli of the Illustrated London News and the Graphic, and a couple of German orderlies. Also accompanying Hicks was a collection of Egyptian administrators sent to re-establish civil control of El Obeid. Power was lucky. He became sick early in the campaign with dysentery and returned to Khartoum. Probably one of the few times in history it was actually a good thing to have rampant diarrhea. The rest, close to 10,000 men and a couple of thousand of camp followers and 5,000 camels, marched west. From the start there were ill omens. Hicks was unable to move his soldiers except in a monstrous hollow square, a formation that reduced his rate of march to only a few miles a day. To boost the troops' confidence, they formed 3 ranks deep, and each man was issued a handful of iron calthrops to throw out in front of him, presumably to puncture the feet of onrushing enemies. But it was a ridiculously slow formation for an army on the march. Hicks's dispatches to Khartoum bore little good news. He could not bring the Mahdi to bay, for that canny desert warrior simply fell back before Hicks's plodding advance. Water and reliable intelligence grew scarcer as the army felt its way westward under a terrible burning sun, in temperatures that reached 127 degrees. The vital camels were ill cared for and died in their droves. Had Hicks followed his instincts, he might have still prevailed. His original plan was a good one. He was going to approach El Obeid from the north. He would march up the banks of the White Nile to Beraa. Then, trekking across the desert, he intended to advance on Bara, and then on to El Obeid, leaving some of his troops in garrison along the way. These garrisons would protect his supply lines and give him a route to retreat along if necessary, while he would still have 7,000 men to deal with the Mahdi's forces at El Obeid. However, Al-Adin Pasha, a former Ottoman cavalry officer whom Hicks himself had proclaimed civil governor-general of the Sudan, and who was to die with him at Shekan, opposed this plan. A telegram from Hicks revealed the dissent, quote, "I was informed by the Governor-General of the Sudan that it was useless for me to expect any supplies to be pushed up from Duam, and that the posts would not guard the convoys, that the Arabs, although now absent from our line of route, would return after we had passed, and that they would be numerous, and the garrisons of the posts would not consider themselves strong enough to forward on the supplies. They would be dangerous, and I would find they would not run the risk. The Governor-General requested me to give up the idea of having this line of posts, to abandon my line of communication and the line of retreat, and to advance with the army on air, with 50 days' supply only, the Arabs closing in our rear. I am naturally averse to this, and have therefore called a council, and have had the matter explained and requested the members to record their opinions." End quote. Al-Adin preferred the more southerly route along the Khor al-Habal, a seasonal watercourse likely to yield more abundant water. Yet it was also hostile and infested with Mahdiist supporters. This is where Hicks' inexperience came to the fore. He wasn't a stupid man. He suspected this was the wrong route to take. But whereas a more seasoned general would have listened to his gut and kept to his original plan, Hicks allowed himself to be reluctantly persuaded by Al-Adin. It would be a fatal decision. The army would advance on the southerly route and wouldn't leave any garrisons behind it. It was now cut off from its supply routes, reliant entirely on local water sources, and didn't have a secure line of retreat. All of Hicks's worries came true. The dervishes operated a scorched earth policy, moving tribes from their villages, polluting or filling in wells, and manipulating the movement of the column. From the day Hicks left the White Nile at Juem on the 22nd of September, 3,000 rebel scouts shadowed him at all times. The column began to feel the enemy's presence. One scout, searching for water supplies, found a well and started back to report. He realized he'd forgotten his rifle and turned back. The column found him the next day, sitting by the well with both his hands cut off. Halfway to El Obeid, the army halted at Aquila, which had excellent water supply. The army rested and drank its fill, but a group of men who wandered away from the camp were slaughtered by the enemy, and their heads put on pikes. One orderly was found disemboweled. Worse was soon to come. Hicks discovered that the Egyptian soldiers had filled less than a third of the water containers at Aquila. Morale plummeted still further as 4 soldiers and more than 100 animals died of thirst. After a skirmish with the Mahdi's followers, Hicks found that the artillery had been so neglected by its commander that it could not even fire. There were also disputes over the reliability of the local guides. Indeed, they may actually have been pro-Mahdi traitors, luring the army into a trap. It didn't help that the Egyptian and European officers were at each other's throats as well. Still they blundered forward, racked by thirst and continually harassed by the Mahdi's men. The last word from Hicks came in a letter to his wife, October the 4th, 1883, quote, "I now hear that there is a broad belt of impenetrable jungle along the core or watercourse we are depending upon. If this is true, I don't know what we shall do, for the army cannot march through it. At present, too, I know nothing of the water supply, whether there is any or not, and with the existence of the army, the lives of 10,000 men dependent upon my decision, and no reliable information, the anxiety is very great, almost too much. Fancy marching an army of this strength through a country where one is entirely dependent upon pools of rainwater, 10,000 men and 6,000 animals to be supplied daily, and no certainty of finding a pool." End quote. The dervishes had occupied the water pool at Burqa, 40 miles south of El Obeid. This gave Hicks no choice but to turn north to another pool, with the unenticing name of Fulla el Mazarin, the pool of the entrails. Sounds lovely. His path took him through the forest of Shekan, where there was dense cover from katia trees and thorn scrub. The scrub here was so dense, in fact, that the force was unable to keep formation. It was an ideal spot for an ambush. Morale was non-existent, destroyed by a shortage of water, the Mahdi's propaganda, and the terrible feeling of isolation. Hicks had only one course of action open to him. He had to press on. Along the way, he received a letter from the Mahdi offering mercy to anybody who would surrender and accept the authority of the Prophet. A follower of the Mahdi recalled Hicks' defiant response, quote, "I am Hicks. My arm is an arm of iron, and my army carries an army in its belly. If the heavens fall, I will hold them up with my bayonets, and if the earth quakes, I will hold it fast with my boot." End quote. There would be no surrender. Hicks was certainly brave. Meanwhile, a German orderly called Gustav Klutz decided he had seen enough and deserted, preferring the chains of the Mahdi's camp to the fate he foresaw for the army. Allegedly, he handed over critical intelligence that led to the upcoming defeat, but I'm not sure I believe that. It seems like an excuse to justify how a European-led army with modern weaponry was beaten by desert warriors. The drunken Irish war correspondent Edmund Donovan of the Daily News was particularly furious at Klutz's betrayal. He wrote in his diary, quote, "What must be the condition of an army when even a European servant deserts to the enemy?" End quote. That was the million-dollar question. On the night of the 3rd of November, the Egyptians dug in behind earthworks, the remains of which were still to be found 50 years afterwards. By the dawn of the next day, the 4th of November, the Mahdi's riflemen had crept through the scrub to within yards of the enemy. Then the Mahdi himself arrived. Bella Ahmad Siraj, one of the Mahdi's men, later said, quote, "We dervishes were anxious to attack at once, but the Mahdi restrained us, so we contented ourselves with skirmishing and firing rifles at the enemy. So fierce was the fire that the bark was stripped from the trees as if they had been washed by soap." End quote. Hicks's force had been moving in 3 large hollow squares, but these soon collapsed under the murderous fire of the dervishes. Almost every bullet found a target, and the Egyptians fired back ineffectually at their invisible assailants. Major Arthur Herleth, an Austrian cavalry officer on Hicks's staff, wrote in his last journal entry that, quote, "The bullets are flying in all directions, and camels, mules, and men keep dropping down. We are all cramped up together, so the bullets cannot fail to strike. We are faint and weary, and have no idea what to do." End quote. Hours later, he was killed. The firefight continued all day. It was unseasonably hot, and by evening the Egyptian soldiers were too thirsty and demoralized to even build a ford enclosure, also known locally as a zareba. The following morning, on the 5th of November, they assembled in 3 squares at about 10 a.m. When they moved off, they left scores of dead behind them, and even artillery pieces whose crews had been wiped out. The Egyptians, by now almost blind with thirst, advanced slowly through the forest, which was less dense here than it had been the previous day. Morale was truly at rock bottom. The Mahdi's men had no such problems. They outnumbered the Egyptians at least 4 to 1, and believed they were fighting for God. That most of the enemy were fellow Muslims mattered not a jot to them. If they were not Mahdyists, they were unbelievers. Besides, the Mahdi had assured his men that they were now invulnerable. He had declared that the enemy's bullets would turn to water. Many of the dervishes wore hijabs, magic amulets made of verses from the Quran rolled inside a leather pouch. These gave them protection against blades and bullets. Claiming a direct revelation from the Prophet Muhammad, the Mahdi also announced that on the day of battle 40,000 angels would join them, swooping down on the unbelievers like giant raptors. Later, some of the tribesmen swore they had actually seen these dark angels on the battlefield. Hicks's doomed force had been pressing forward for no more than an hour when the dervishes launched their final, devastating charge. The Battle of Shekan had begun. The savage attack by 40,000 screaming dervishes smashed to the Egyptian column. Hicks's force had been moving tactically in 3 ragged squares, 1 up and 2 back. The leading square had buckled instantly under the onslaught. The riflemen in the flanking squares were so exhausted and racked with thirst that they could hardly focus. They had wheeled and fired blindly into the melee, killing their own comrades as well as the enemy. According to Mohammed Nur al-Barudi, Hicks's cook, who survived after being shot and slashed with a sword, quote, "The dervishes simultaneously attacked from the woods on both sides, and from the front and rear. The wildest confusion followed. Squares fired on each other, on friends and enemies. The surging mass of dervishes now completely circled the force and gradually closed in on them." End quote. Any remnants of discipline among Hicks's force evaporated. The only organised resistance came from the 11 European officers and their bodyguards. On the point of the column when the attack came, they drew up with their backs to a tree and fought to the last man. Hicks himself was one of the last to die. He emptied his revolver 3 times, loading and reloading automatically. The dervishes swarm around you as you gun down one of them, who charges towards you with a 10-foot spear. There are just 3 Europeans left, including General Hicks, but you won't go down without a fight. Hicks pulls the trigger of his revolver, but only a dull click emerges. Throwing away the now useless weapon, he charges out on his faithful steed, brandishing his sword so maniacally that the dervishes actually run away at the sight. He pursues them, hacking away with his sword, dodging spear points and bloodied knives. Finally, his horse is killed, and he tumbles to the floor. A triumphant dervish rushes up to deal the fatal blow, but Hicks rises with a roar of "For king and country!" and runs him through. Alone he stands, battling away, stabbing and punching the Mahdi's fanatical followers, until finally a spear plunges into his chest and he falls to the floor. Inspired by his heroism, reload your gun and begin blasting away as the dervishes turn back towards you. This is really how Hicks died, fighting to the very last, a heroic end for this brave man. He had made mistakes, but really he had done the best he could with an incredibly poor army. The blame lay in Cairo and London, rather than just with this proud veteran of the Indian Army. Sheikh Ali Gullah, a leading dervish, would praise Hicks's bravery, quote, "He was full of courage like an elephant. He feared nothing, the bravest of men I have known," end quote. Afterwards, the heads of both Hicks and Seckendorf were cut off and carried as trophies to the dervish camp. Later, they were stuck on the spikes over the gate of El Obeid. Comically, Hicks' cook was spared as he somehow managed to convince the Mahdi that he was a doctor. He appears to have practiced medicine with the Mahdi's forces until he escaped 5 years after the debacle at Sheikhan. God help his patients. 300 Egyptian soldiers who had survived by hiding under the piles of dead were herded together. They were stripped naked and sent to El Obeid, with ropes around their necks. Those who were not executed later were left to beg in the marketplace, and eventually died of starvation. Only a few hundred dervishes had been killed. These included the sheikh of the Kinna tribe from the White Nile, and 14 of his men, who had been blown to shreds by a single artillery shell, proving, at least, the Hicks men did get their guns into action at least once. These, and the other dervish dead, were buried with a simple ceremony, while the enemy dead were left for the vultures. When the stench of the dead bodies grew too oppressive, the dervishes decamped for El Obeid. On the day after the victory, there had been 100 guns salute in the town. Now, there were scenes of savage ecstasy as the victorious warriors marched in trailing shrouds of dust. You excitedly watch as the victorious army of God returns to El Obeid. First comes the banners, scarlet, black and green, followed by ranks of footmen, tens of thousands strong, the tips of their leaf-bladed spears danced and scintillated, still stained with the infidels' blood. The soldiers moved to a mesmerizing chant of "There is no God but Allah," occasionally stopping to brandish their spears and let out blood-curdling roars. After them comes the cavalry, trotting, reining in, and launching suddenly into ferocious mock charges, with their spears thrust out. Following them are the foreigners who presume to rule your lands. Turks and Egyptian prisoners. Naked and fearful, they look like mere boys compared to the men of the Mahdi. Dragged forward by ropes, you jeer and spit on them, along with the rest of the crowd. Then, finally, after the captured guns, comes the Mahdi himself, mounted on a white camel. You scream out in excitement, and the crowd goes wild. You rush forward to kiss his feet and to touch his robes, while others hurl themselves flat and kiss the ground on which his camel has walked. A chant arises from 1,000 voices. "The Mahdi, God's expected one! The Mahdi, God's expected one!" The Mahdi had performed a miracle. He had gathered an army of tribesmen and peasants from scratch. He had taken on the largest government force ever sent into the region, and he had annihilated it. From this day on, the Mahdi became an object of veneration. The very water with which he made his ablutions was collected and handed out as a cure-all for ailments. The Mahdi was believed to be replete with Baraka, the mystical life force possessed by all holy men. Those who had believed from the beginning that he was the Messiah foretold in legend could point to Shaitan as proof. Those who had not believed could either profess themselves convinced or go along for the ride. Even the Mahdi himself had not expected such a complete victory. He knew that he was no longer leading a rebellion. The balance of power had tipped, and he now had the Sudan in the palm of his hand. The government still possessed minor garrisons in the other provinces, but most were held by small numbers of ill-equipped troops, isolated in remote outposts in the trackless wilderness. They did not worry the Mahdi. The only obstacle that truly remained lay 300 miles to the east, where a thin grey line of soldiers manned the ramparts of Khartoum. The Mahdi's legendary showdown with General Charles Gordon, soon to be known as Gordon of Khartoum, was about to begin. With the defeat of the Hicks expedition, the Mahdi's visionary spirit would hold sway in the Sudan until 1898, when the bubble burst forever before the modern rifles and Maxim guns of a well-trained Anglo-Egyptian army at Omdurman. On that day, Gordon and William Hicks would finally be avenged. The Mahdi's legacy would live on, however. He remains the great hero and founding father of modern Sudan. Thank you for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. In the next episode, we begin our series on the Spanish Civil War. Fascism and communism, tradition and progress, democracy and authoritarianism will clash in an epic contest that will be the prelude to the Second World War. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.